Bradley infantry fighting vehicle is, as its name says, not a tank, but a vehicle meant to hold troops around the battlefield and provide fire support. However, there were instances in the past where Bradleys held their own against tanks, notably the recent Ukraine video against the Russian T-90M, but also in 1991, where US Bradleys won against Iraqi tanks. So yeah, if everything is right, Bradleys can more than hold their own. But how would Bradleys fare against tanks regularly? That depends on many variables, and this video will explore just those. How likely is it that Bradleys win against tanks consistently? Hey, what is this? A cute Binkov plushie? Well, I guess I could use an adjutant. Come here, little fella, I'll take you home. And you too can take your own Binkov adjutant.
Available at Crowdmade store.
Yep, we made a Binkov plushie. If you want one for yourself or as a gift,
do check out our Crowdmade store.
The link is available below in the video description. It's not too small, not too big, perfect for your desk or your shelf next to your military history books. Or you can give it away. We've made it as low cost as humanly possible, which is very hard when you're contracting very small production runs. Well, go ahead and treat yourself. The Bradley is a combat vehicle that trades armor for internal space and to an extent for firepower. Armor-wise, it can't stand up to even 1960s tank rounds, let alone anything newer. That being said, a round that penetrates a vehicle doesn't have to destroy it, or even kill most people aboard. There were examples from 1991 Iraq, where Abramses shot Bradleys on accident, yet most crew members survived, even without serious injuries. But Bradley's main defense is usually to stay away from the enemy. If a Bradley is hit by a tank round, its 30-something mm worth of base armor frontally is not gonna do a thing. Bradleys today often also use explosive reactive armor tiles, but those were primarily designed to defeat RPG-class shaped warheads. A secondary role of those era tiles on Bradley is to hold their own against a 30 mm autocannon round, which offers several times less penetration than a tank's kinetic anti-tank dart. Bradleys in 1991 didn't use additional era armor blocks. Those had no chance of shrugging off a hit. So one could say that against certain old tanks, today's Bradleys might have a slightly higher chance of not getting penetrated when hit at certain favorable angles. What Bradleys can do against certain tanks in certain situations is to spot the tank before being spotted, target it, and engage it with its TOW anti-tank guided missile from a distance. Usually from enough of a distance that the tank would rarely be able to spot the threat in time and fire back. The TOW missile launch produces little smoke, and at over 3 kilometers, most tank crews will not spot the threat most of the time. So even with a 20-second missile flight time, the Bradley should still be safe, but that's all if the tank is not alerted. TOW missile is very potent against tanks, with penetration usually estimated at around 1000 mm of steel for head-on impact variants. Though a top attack variant targeting the tank's thin roof armor is also used. Those are often lethal even against most modern tanks out there. So the question is perhaps not whether the TOW missile will penetrate the tank, but whether it will hit due to target moving, obstacles and possible smoke, and whether it will do enough damage depending on where exactly it hits. Though again, that can be said for any weapon. So a single missile fired may not result in the enemy tank being neutralized. The Bradleys have 2 TOW missiles ready to be fired. Issue is, given that the missile in flight is guided by the Bradley, that the second missile is fired only after the first one completes its run. So for the newer, longer range TOW missiles, it might take even close to a minute until the second missile hits the target. Of course, it's not unimaginable that even 2 TOW missiles fired at the tank do not result in a mission kill. Maybe they would miss anything crucial on the tank, or miss completely. If that happens, the Bradley can only back up and hide, if spotted from a distance. While it has 5 additional TOW missiles stored, replenishing the launcher requires a minute, and a crew member half exposed. TOW missiles were roughly similar in capabilities both in 1991 Iraq today in Ukraine and in tomorrow's US latest Bradleys. The remaining big difference will cover our optical and thermal sights. In 1991, US Bradleys used the first generational thermal sight for the gunner. The commander had no separate thermal sight of his own. In 1991, against Iraqi tanks, that thermal sight was worth a lot, as Iraqi tanks back then had nothing comparable. Here's what the US report on Bradley performance said of its sight after the war. Crews were able to distinguish between friendly and enemy vehicles up to 1,500 to 2,000 meters. That was at night, under clear conditions. Under rainy conditions, the identification distance was 500-ish meters. Of course, Iraqi tanks, having no thermal sights at all, fared worse at night. Most were limited to using human eyesight, as most didn't even have night vision devices. So distance varied greatly due to ambient light. Could have been under 100 meters or several hundred meters. But even then, at times well over 10 minutes was needed for the eye to get accustomed to low light. A simple gun flash could reset that count for eye adjustment. In a battle, you don't have that time. Those few tanks that did have night vision and even infrared illuminators, those could recognize targets at half a kilometer to a kilometer away. Iraqi tanks didn't have a separate night vision sight for the commander. So generally, individual Bradleys in 1991 could see first and shoot first. That's on top of US situational awareness edge, where other assets tracked most of Iraqi forces and directed US Abramses and Bradleys to engage them under favorable conditions. Today in Ukraine, Russia deploys a whole range of tanks and optics. A good deal of those tanks have no thermal sights, as they're old stocks of tanks put back into service. Some, however, have been retrofitted with fairly simple, almost commercial-grade thermal sights. And Russia's best tanks, like the modernized T-72s and the T-90M, used second-generation military-grade sights. Prior to 2014, French thermal sensors were put into Russian sights, and afterwards, Russia seems to have replicated Sense sensor with one of more or less the same capability, even mirroring the exact number of detector elements inside the sensor. Those are decent sensors, and there are both better and worse thermal sights in Ukraine's hands now. The maker of the French sensor says the recognition of a tank-sized target can be made at roughly 4.5 kilometers away. Bradley used by Ukraine is the M2A4 ODS SA variant. SA stands for Situational Awareness. It basically digitizes the Bradley using many subsystems of the US M2A3, including its advanced second-generation thermal sight. One thing it lacks, though, is a separate thermal sight for the commander. Though that feature is missing on most Russian tanks as well, with the exception of the newest T-90M and a few of the latest T-72 modifications. The latter use a cheaper, near commercial-grade thermal sensor. But having a separate sensor for the commander on any vehicle is quite important. Bradley in Ukraine, without one, is forced to slew its entire turret around to look for targets. Tanks which do have independent commander sights can rotate them around independent of the turret. Another pair of eyes looking for threats and recognizing them, even if it's just at 1,500 meters away at night, is still quite a boon. What Bradley in Ukraine does have is at least an equally capable sight for the gunner. While its maker doesn't disclose precise ranges, it does say this. Compared to the first generation sights like in 1991, the second generation increases detection range by 78% and recognition capabilities by 232% at night. Using the 1991 figures as a baseline, that suggests the second gen can do tank recognition from 3.5 to 4.5 kilometers, roughly similar to the French sight. But given the vague starting point claim on first gen US sight and the twice the element count on the US sensor, it's plausible that Bradley sensor performance is actually even a bit better. While Russia doesn't have anything better in active service than the T-90M, the US does. If the newest US Bradleys, the M2A4s, would meet the best Russian tanks, they could outsight them. They use third-generation thermal sights for the gunner and the commander. A staring array sight gives a very clear image. While exact performance isn't given, it's plausibly similar to the French third-generation Catherine MP sensor. The maker advertised its performance, recognition of tank-sized targets possible at 10 to 12 kilometers. So in a hypothetical one-on-one fight, the latest US Bradley would almost surely detect the latest Russian active service tank first, depending on the terrain of course. In urban fights for example, or any other fight with a cluttered horizon, sight range advantage means less. Ukrainian Bradleys and latest Russian tanks are roughly similar there. Russia may hold an edge with some tank models due to the commander also having a sight, but many other tanks lack those. And 1991 Bradleys were generally an overmatch for Iraqi tanks. A small caveat, cherry-picking examples of Bradley fights against tanks from history is never advisable. In real-world examples there are always many variables in play. Anyway, the Bradley crews from 1st Armored Division and 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment reported that in 1991 they destroyed Iraqi tanks with TOW missiles, with engagement distances ranging from 800 to 3,700 meters. Bradleys did sometimes get destroyed by tanks when in direct battles in 1991. The 32nd Armored Regiment had 2 M3 Scout Bradleys engaging a single T-72. Initial TOW missile hit but failed to neutralize the tank. Tank then neutralized one Bradley before falling victim to another missile. The most famous example from 1991 Iraq was when 2 Scout Bradleys stumbled upon several Iraqi dug-in tanks. Completely surprising the Iraqis, a Bradley fired its 25mm gun from point-blank distance into a tank's side, disabling it. Moments later, Bradleys fired TOW missiles from just 300 meters away, killing 3 more tanks. Due to the slow Iraqi reaction, reloaded TOWs destroyed another T-72. At least 5 T-72 tanks were destroyed on that occasion. Of course, more than one Bradley was lost in Iraq. Later, the US Army Office for Operations and Plans said 20 Bradleys were destroyed and another 12 damaged, but only 12 out of 32 were hit by enemy fire. 1991 Iraq was clearly not an even fight though, with so much intelligence gathering, training and technological superiority working for the US and coalition forces. Bradleys were often using their thermal sights to help through bad weather, firing TOW missiles at more or less blind Iraqi tanks. But what about more recent set of examples? In Ukraine there was an occasion in July 2023 where Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister said one Bradley engaged 2 Russian T-72s and destroyed them both with TOW missiles. Of course, a much more recent example is from this past January, when a lone Russian T-90M tank, Russia's best and newest, wandered into a village alone without support, and 2 Bradleys met it at almost point-blank range, maybe 100 or 200 meters away. It was not clear from the engagement accounts whether missiles have been used earlier, or whether some third-party munitions have hit the tank. But at one point, a Bradley used its 25mm gun shooting at tank's frontal armor. The commander of the Bradley was later interviewed, saying they were not doing damage with armor-piercing rounds, so they switched to explosive rounds to go after tank sensors. At such a small distance, that's certainly a valid tactic. The skirmish ended with the tank disabled, fleeing and ultimately its 3 crew members leaving the tank. So yeah, there are several examples of Bradleys going head-to-head with tanks, even using guns and disabling tanks, but those are outliers. Of course, a video of such an event is going to be repeated in all media. It does not make it a standard tactic. Specifically, a tank should never be sent to or venture alone into urban surroundings, where buildings are obstructing its view. Even at short ranges, Bradleys would usually go for their TOW missiles. If they did not do that this time in Ukraine, it may have meant they were out of missiles. Disabling tank sensors or subsystems with smaller caliber guns is possible, but in most situations it will not happen. Most fights will be fought at longer distances, and cannon fire will disperse, not hitting often enough anything of importance. Bradley can perform great even when attacking if the situation is right. It all depends on variables, whether the landscape is cluttered or not, or whether the spotting of the enemy happens before Bradley is spotted, whether enemy tanks are technologically much older, whether Bradley can surprise them from the rear or the sides. Even when the enemy is on equal terms, Bradleys can perform admirably when defending. Tanks coming towards hidden Bradleys are usually at a disadvantage, as they can be reached by TOW missiles from over 4 kilometers away. But when Bradley's location is known to the enemy, like Russian tanks, then they can engage. They have guided missiles which they fire from their main guns, which outrange even the TOW missile. On a clear day, if the area is flat, tanks are gonna see the Bradleys at a roughly same distance and get to fire their missiles first. Of course, smoke cover is often used, which could cause missiles to miss. If the tank is T-90M or T-72B3, then it would benefit from its laser warning system, which would make sure the smoke screen and decoys are fired at the right moment and in the right direction, making smoke cover more effective. But for some reason, possibly pure inertia or penny pinching, Bradleys and Abrams have not been fitted with laser warning receivers, which means Bradleys would need to manually deploy smoke cover, lowering its effectiveness. If Bradleys are advancing and manage to close the distance, then they could launch tow missiles. Laser-guided missiles in Russian tanks nor optically guided tow missiles can perform well when obstructed by smoke. To launch tow at max range, Bradley would also need to use the laser rangefinder, which would alert a tank like T-90 and show it the direction of the laser threat. Another issue for the Bradley would be the fact it has to be stationary while guiding its tow missile. During the 20 or so seconds of the missile's flight, the opposing tanks could use regular gun rounds as well. A big stationary vehicle, even at 4 kilometers, is a fairly undemanding target. Stock gun on the T-72 firing an old kinetic penetrator at 2 kilometers away in Slovak army tests yield 20 out of 21 shots fired within 90 centimeters of the target. Same tests showed that the modernized Slovakian gun for T-72 would have yielded 19 out of 21 shots landing inside 1 meters from the center at 4 kilometers. Bradley's 25mm gun is not designed for such long-distance work. At 4 kilometers away, its dispersion might be an issue. Its armor-piercing rounds fired at low rate of fire are credited with 0.59 milliradians of dispersion, which is roughly half to a third of the accuracy of a tank's main gun. There may be shots missing the center of a tank by a few meters, enough to miss it completely. At 100 rounds per minute fire rate, required to achieve somewhat better precision, it's likely a few seconds of fire would be needed for one hit to land onto the tank. And given the small size of delicate subsystems on the tank, such as the sights, it's improbable anything crucial would be hit from such a distance. Some 7 to 8 seconds after the first shot, the tank could shoot again. By the time Bradley's missile crosses 4 kilometers, the tank could shoot once more for a total of 3 shots. While a hit doesn't have to disable a Bradley, 3 hits would. Of course, that's all a very gamey setup. In the real world, there would be more units on both sides. There would be plenty of laser sources. There would be plenty of missiles, gun rounds and smoke across the battlefield. Both sides would miss often. In reality, the battle would be about creating an opportunity to overmatch the opponent, if it would not be possible to surprise them. At medium distances, a modern tank would still have an upper hand. It's only at a few hundred meters away where tow guidance would take maybe a second or two, and where Bradley's crew would be able to actually aim for very specific parts of the tank and reliably hit them right away. That's where the Bradley might have roughly equal or even somewhat higher chances, really coming down to who gets to fire first. In just 3 seconds, 10 rounds could land on the tank's turret, aimed at its weak points like the sights. Even the tank's barrel might get hurt. 30mm rounds did this to barrels of Iraqi tanks from greater distances. Latest 25mm rounds can penetrate over 100mm of steel. A modern US Bradley would have somewhat better chances against a tank one-on-one, but only barely, as the sight advantage is not so huge in a gamey head-on setup. But if allowed to really take advantage of it, trying to flank the enemy at night, or if applied to real-world setup with many other variables, the benefits of more modern sights do start adding up. It still doesn't guarantee a fair chance against a modern tank, but it does give a fighting chance. Bradley winning against a modern tank? Sure, sometimes, rarely, but it can be done, and when it happens, it's a big news story. The Bradley is a 1980s vehicle after all. There are better vehicles of the same class out there, which is why the US Army is developing its successor in the XM30 program, which will outdo it in all departments, including a main gun twice as big, possibly twice as many missiles, and certainly missiles that would threaten tanks much more. That's it for this video. As you saw at the beginning of the video, we still have some plushies on sale. This is the second batch of the plushies that we made, and if we are to make another one, which is not yet sure, we may make some changes to the design. Yes, that may mean I will see a different uniform, for example. Can't wear old clothes your whole life. Anyway, if you liked our video, hit the like button, subscribe, it's not just empty words, it helps our channel. And until next time, salutations. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.